Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Church Coffee, Christianity, Conservatism, and Culture. I'm joined today by Dr. Christian Sahner. He's a associate professor of Islamic history at New College, University of Oxford. He will be talking today about early Christian-Muslim relations. Dr. Sahner, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Rob.
So you are American, but working in the UK. So gotta ask, are you a coffee drinker or have you been converted to tea?
Well, my wife is a great tea drinker. If you saw me and not just heard me, you'd see a coffee in my hand. So I'm definitely a coffee drinker.
Excellent. What's your story? Give us a quick bio of how you came to study this material and how you ended up at Oxford University.
I grew up in New Jersey. I was born in New York City, raised just outside in northern New Jersey. I was in the States through my undergraduate years. I was an undergraduate at Princeton. Came to Oxford for the first time as a master's student, and then ultimately returned to the States, returned to Princeton for my PhD. And now I've been working here as a professor for the past decade or so. So my professional life has been between the two places. Uh, I don't have a personal or a family or a religious connection to the Middle East. I guess I got interested in that world for two reasons. The intellectual explanation is that I always loved studying languages. I had studied Latin and Greek long before I came to Arabic or Persian or any Middle Eastern language. And I quickly realized that uh, a lot of the action in Roman history, a lot of the action in the history of the early church was happening in places that today are overwhelmingly Muslim. So I got interested in how that process unfolded, um, how much changed, how slowly, how quickly did it change. And that's still more or less the field in which I work today. The more personal reason is that I was a teenager. I was in high school when 9/11 happened. And as I mentioned, I grew up just outside New York City. And at the top of my hill, which is some of the first high ground that you'll get outside of New York City, you get a clean view of Lower Manhattan. So for me and for lots of other people, whether you live close to New York or not, that day was very, very important. So I think I belong to a generation, especially of American scholars of the Middle East, who became interested in that region because of this primordial shock, in a way that, say, the generation ahead, two generations ahead of me, got interested in Russia because of events in the news, the Cold War. I think quite a few of us initially became curious about the Middle East, Muslim societies, because of these tragic events that happened now many years ago. So for me, it's a combination of intellectual and kind of situational, personal reasons that drew me in.
We'll be working through three or four different sections in this interview. So our first section is what did Christianity look like in late antiquity Middle East before the rise of Islam? What percent of the area we now know as Middle East was Christian before the rise of Islam?
Well, the Middle East before the rise of Islam was overwhelmingly Christian. By the 7th century, there were essentially no historic pagan populations left in that part of the world. There were very substantial Jewish populations, but overshadowed by the very significant Christian populations. Now, Christians on the eve of Islam, to say nothing of the Islamic period too, were not monolithic. They were made up of many, many different groups, lots of different churches that disagreed over questions of theology, doctrine, authority, all the rest. But if you take Christians as a block and not as um, as a mix of different groups, there's no question that they were the overwhelming majority of the population in the late ancient Middle East before the rise of Islam.
To what extent were these peoples literate?
Well, that's really a question about pre-modern or pre-industrial societies the world over. It's not just a question about the late antique Middle East or any other corner of the late antique world. I mean, until you get to the 19th century, most societies were heavily non-literate. These were societies where you had a learned elite who could read and write, but it was an overwhelmingly agrarian peasant population in the Middle East and throughout the late antique world. So one of the great questions that scholars have had, especially in recent years, and here I'm thinking of the work of my friend and colleague Jack Tanous at Princeton University, who works in a very similar field to mine, is how do we make sense of a late Roman Christian society of the kind that existed before the rise of Islam, which defined itself in largely theological categories, divided itself as a result of disagreements about, the nature of the Trinity, the nature of the Incarnation, And those are high wattage, very complicated theological questions that would not have perhaps been intelligible in their specifics to this overwhelmingly agrarian, non-literate population. So how do you
To
reconcile?
to be fair, it's still probably above most Christians
Yes, yes, of
today.
course. I think mass literacy probably doesn't change that. I think most of us remain deeply confused about precisely what's happening in these great theological debates. But the paradox is even more striking in a society in which people could not necessarily read and write, a society and a world in which printing did not exist, and yet that society did divide itself according to identities that were ultimately premised on extremely complex, sophisticated theological and philosophical categories. So that's one of the great questions for anyone who's interested in the history of the early church, especially in understanding the nature and the breakdown of the society in the Middle East before the Arab conquests.
So I asked that question because was the Bible or even the New Testament only in Latin and Greek at this time, or had it been translated into other lingua franca languages throughout the Middle East? Arabic, Coptic, Syriac. Before the rise of Islam, was the New Testament available in uh, more minor languages, one might say?
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, one of the great stories in the history of language is related to the history of the translation of the Bible. It's not that these languages did not exist before Christianity or did not exist before Christianization, but the need to essentially canonize or codify these languages as written languages is largely a process driven by the need to translate the Bible. We see that certainly in the case of languages like Armenian or Georgian in the Caucasus. To some extent, it's also true of Syriac, although we have pagan Syriac literature from before the Christian period. But basically, the New Testament is written in Greek, thereafter translated into Syriac, then into Latin. And as all of these different peoples on the edge of the late ancient world become Christian, the scriptures need to be put into the vernacular. And those processes kind of go hand in hand. Now, when it comes to Arabic, there were huge numbers of Arabic speaking Christians before the rise of Islam. Um, Often we look upon Arabic as being a uniquely Islamic language. And historically speaking, this is not the case. I mean, as I mentioned, there were plenty of Arabic speaking Christians before. And one assumes, I'm of the mind that there must have been some version of the Bible in Arabic before Islam, precisely because so many of these other language groups, speakers of different languages, as soon as they underwent a process of Christianization, also put the Christian scriptures into the vernacular. So we see the social and the religious process on the part of Arabic speakers in late antiquity. We don't necessarily see the literary residue of this in the form of a surviving translation of the Bible from the pre-Islamic period. But I think there are good contextual reasons to imagine that it very well may have existed.
Our next section is more specific. I guess that was kind of a preamble, but this will be on Muhammad in the Quran and Christians. So the Quran presents Christians as being in the Hijaz. To what extent is that true? It sounds like maybe, but also maybe not.
Well, late antique Arabia was incredibly mixed. It was as diverse culturally, linguistically, and religiously as many other corners of the late antique world, say the Mediterranean. Um, Now, this runs counter to the way in which people traditionally looked upon pre-Islamic Arabia. So if you read, say, Islamic accounts of pre-Islamic Arabia, of the kind that were written and redacted in the 9th and the 10th centuries in a place like Baghdad, which at that time was the seat, the capital of the great Islamic empire, the empire of the Abbasids, one would have the misimpression that pre-Islamic Arabia was largely a world of pagans, polytheists who worshipped idols, other objects. And this is part of the self-image that medieval Muslim writers give to their pre-Islamic past. Um, in recent years, however, academics have arrived at a more nuanced and complex picture of the religious demography of pre-Islamic Arabia. And what many specialists now believe is that the world was extremely mixed. There were, of course, polytheists. The true extent of polytheism in Arabia before Islam is to some extent an open question. It's a really interesting question. But along with polytheists, you had huge numbers of Jews, you had huge numbers of Christians. And when it comes to the subregion of Arabia known as the Hijaz, and by Hijaz, I'm referring to the western portion of what is today the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the region that encompasses the great shrine cities of Mecca and Medina. There, the population seems to have been mixed. The most visible portion of the non-pagan population are Jews. So when you read biographical accounts of the Prophet Muhammad, the major non-Muslim community with which that early community of believers is interacting are Jews. As some of your listeners may know, Islamic history is measured from an event called the Hijra, or the emigration. This occurs in the year 622, and it's when Muhammad and his earliest followers leave their hometown of Mecca, where they experienced persecution at the hands of the local pagan population, their kinsmen, and they emigrated to a second city, Medina. The population of Medina was made up of originally polytheistic Arabian tribesmen, along with Jews. And the interactions between the nascent Muslim community, led by Muhammad, and those Jews is among the defining stories and themes of early Islamic history, a relationship that was originally very close and productive, and ultimately sours. So we can say there are large numbers of polytheists, there are large numbers of Jews, and if you read the text of the Quran, it is obvious that the preaching, the message of the early Muslims was also addressed to Christian populations. Now, it's a bit harder to say who these Christian populations were. We have clear evidence, historical evidence of Christian populations in other parts of the Arabian Peninsula, but based on our current state of knowledge, figuring out precisely who these Christians were in the Hijaz is a bit harder. But in general, we can speak about three major non-Muslim communities: polytheists, Jews, and Christians, with the Jews probably being the most politically significant of these groups, especially when it comes to the early history of Islam.
There are pretty contentious views between Muslims and Christians, especially when it comes to Jesus. How does the Islamic Isa differ from the Christian Jesus?
Well, the major difference is that Muslims then, as well as Muslims today, did not regard Jesus as being divine. They speak about him as being the son of Mary, thereby, and that kind of epithet emphasizes the humanity of Jesus, Jesus the prophet, not Jesus, son of God, as God himself, which is, of course, how Christians understand him. So, the Quran talks about lots of prophets who would have been known to Jews and Christians in late antiquity, and indeed are known to Jews and Christians today. It accepts that great line of prophets that one knows from the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. And among the greatest of these prophets is Jesus. So that is the way in which he is represented, not as necessarily a unique figure, but rather as a prophet of special esteem, but a mere man. And so the Quran goes to great lengths to demonstrate, for instance, that although Jesus was crucified, he was not resurrected, he only appeared to die, those sorts of things. Now, early Islamic sources of the period shortly after the Quran have lots to say about the eschatological role of Jesus. That is to say, Jesus is a figure who is active in the Muslim account of the end times. So again, these traditions emphasize that he is a prophet of unique significance. He is not a mere prophet, but the key thing is that he is not God himself. That's the basic distinction between the way Christians and Muslims then, as well as today, view the figure of Jesus.
How did Christians, let's say between 650 and 800, view Muhammad? I picked that period because, especially now, obviously Christians the world over would view Muhammad pretty negatively, but how did Christians in this early period of Islamic expansion view Muhammad?
This is another hot academic question. People have written lots about this over the past several decades, a number of them extremely provocative books. What's interesting about your question is that a lot changes between, say, 650 and 800. I mean, from a modern point of view, that's not too much time, but in the unfolding of history, that's actually several generations in which Christian communities who found themselves under Muslim rule arrived at a more complete and nuanced picture of who the Prophet Muhammad was. So when you read some of the earliest Christian accounts of the rise of Islam, which are often partial, which are often laconic, which are often ill-informed, if one can speak about it that way, the Prophet emerges primarily as a political leader, and the dominion of the Muslim conquerors is primarily a political enterprise. It's a political undertaking, not necessarily a spiritual or a religious one. The early Christian observers of the rise of Islam often emphasize the ethnic aspect of the Muslim conquerors. So what strikes them is less their ideological stance than the fact that they were Arabs, they were Arabians, they were speakers of a semi-common language, a shared language. They emanated from a particular geographic area, far more than they were Muslims as such. So the typical terminology emphasizes their Arabness as opposed to their Muslimness, if that makes sense. But as time moves on, Christians begin to engage with the Quran. They acquire knowledge of the biographical traditions of Muhammad. So by the time you get to the 9th and certainly the 10th century, you have lots of very deep, rich, polemical engagement with Islamic beliefs and doctrines. And within that effort, you get fascinating, essentially polemical biographies of Muhammad, where Christians are riffing on themes that are known more fully from Islamic biographical literature about Muhammad, but often reframing those details, reframing those stories in order to make land polemical or doctrinal blows against Muslims. So, for instance, one of the major stories that various Christian polemical writers pick up on, and we find this in the East, the eastern reaches of the Islamic Empire, places like Iraq and Syria, but we also find it in the western reaches of what began as the Muslim Empire in the Iberian Peninsula, which is today Spain and Portugal. People pick up on stories of, for instance, the Prophet's multiple marriages. That's a big theme that Christian writers focus upon. They tell stories of his marriage, for instance, with Zainab. Zainab was the wife of one of the Prophet's companions. He's very taken with her. She divorces the Prophet's companion. She marries him. So from the perspective of an early medieval Christian reading this or learning about this literature, this episode was considered to be scandalous and is therefore retold now for polemical purposes.
What about his marriage to Aisha? Because that seems to have only gotten traction in polemics only in the last 150 years. I'm noticing you're picking up on just multiple marriages or marriage to someone else who was married to someone else already. Did his youngest wife ever see traction during this period, or was that just kind of like, oh, this is kind of normal?
Well, most of what I know about this comes from my former student here in Oxford, Dr. Joshua Little, who I know has been a guest on this podcast before. And my impression from Josh is that you're absolutely right that the Aisha story, that is to say, the Prophet's marriage to a very young girl, which today is to some extent a stock feature in polemics against Islam, or at least polemics about the Prophet's life, because it runs counter to modern sensibilities about the age of consent, the age at which it's appropriate to marry. That really doesn't figure in any of these early polemical traditions about the Prophet's life. I think it's partly because in the ancient world, the late ancient world, there was perhaps a consensus among adherents of a wide variety of religions about the age of consent or lack thereof, the proper age at which people got married. This was a world in which people had children far earlier than people tend to have today, especially in say the United States and Europe. So this would have struck them as perhaps less scandalous than it does to some modern eyes. There were other aspects of the Prophet's biography, however, that they definitely did seize upon, such as, for instance, the general theme of multiple marriages, the fact that the Prophet is both preaching a spiritual message, but also engaged in warfare, and is thus, in the eyes of these polemicists, kind of a very worldly prophet. There were other themes to emphasize, but not the story of Aisha.
Later chapters of the Quran, notably chapters 8 and 9, and as a quick aside, the Quran is not done chronologically, it's not organized chronologically, it's organized systematically. And so these later chapters of the Quran chronologically actually come quite earlier. So later chapters of the Quran, these chapters 8 and 9, are quite striking towards unbelievers. Are these unbelievers pagan in Mecca, or does anyone that does not accept Islam, like Jews and Christians, unbelievers in the eyes of surahs 8 and 9?
To be honest, I don't have surahs 8 and 9 of the Quran at my fingertips in order to comment on your question specifically. What I would say is that the Quran is not organized systematically. That's not the word that I would use. In general, the Quran is organized according to the length of the surah, the length of the chapter. So by and large, we're talking about long surahs, long chapters at the beginning of the Quran, and short declarative surahs at the very end. That's the big way in which the text is structured. And within that, there is a view shared by pre-modern Muslim scholars as well as modern scholars, non-Muslim scholars, or scholars writing from an academic perspective, which seeks to create a chronology for the revelation of the Quran. So what you're referring to is essentially chapters that are thought to have been revealed while the Prophet was still in Mecca at the head of a persecuted religious community. There are other verses that are thought to have been revealed when the Prophet and his followers left Mecca and go to Medina. So Meccan and Medanese surahs. There's also a distinction between what people describe as early Meccan, late Meccan, early Medanese, late Medanese. But if these chronological definitions have any merit, it provides a possible way of imagining the evolution in the religious themes of the Quran, an evolution in the teaching or what was being preached to this community of early believers. And so this grafts onto your bigger question because scholars will often attempt to decipher whether or not there is an evolving attitude towards people outside of this early community of believers. Is there a moment in which the early believers, the early Muslims, are more accommodating toward religious outsiders, whether those be polytheists or Jews or Christians? Are there moments in which the discourse hardens and it seems that these communities are to be treated more kind of more fiercely or with less accommodation? One of the big academic debates that you may be aware of is whether or not the Quran addresses itself to a religiously mixed audience. So we imagine that what it means to be a Muslim today is identical to what it means to be a Muslim in the early period. And as my colleague Fred Donner at the University of Chicago would point out, one of the great historians of early Islam, when the Quran addresses its audience, it seldom uses the term Muslim, in Arabic, Muslimun. The term that the Quran typically uses to address its insider audience is actually believers. And the Arabic term here is al-mu'minun. Donner's argument, which has been widely debated and persuasive in broad stroke, is that what it meant to be a believer was not strictly speaking to be a Muslim in the technical sense of the term. A Jew could be a believer, a Christian could be a believer, provided that individual assented to the teachings of Muhammad, regarded him as a prophet, and signed up to certain kind of doctrinal positions, certain pious practices, regular ritualized prayer, that sort of thing. But by and large, so while the Quranic discourse on Jews and Christians varies depending on the surah in question, by and large, and here I'm painting with a very broad stroke, the Quran typically takes a far more strident stance against the polytheists, who are known by different names in the Quran. Sometimes they're called kuffar, which is probably best translated as infidels. Polytheists are also referred to as mushrikun, which we might translate as pagan, polytheist, something like that. These are individuals who engage in what the Quran describes as shirk. Shirk is an Arabic word which means association. So the central error, the cardinal sin of the polytheists was to associate God with created objects and beings. So to associate God with things that did not deserve or did not merit human worship, that is the essence of polytheism. And so the general discourse towards the polytheists, regardless of where you're looking in the Quran, tends to be fairly unforgiving and strident.
Our next section is Muslims' treatment of Christians. The Islamic armies that advanced out of Arabia after Muhammad's death saw just absolutely stunning victories. To what extent was this a political expansion, or was it a religious one, or are they under Islam, or is that kind of one and the same?
I think that the Arab conquests, sometimes also called the Islamic conquests, there's a political dimension, there's a religious dimension, and I think it's very difficult to separate the two. Now, to speak about Arab conquest as opposed to Islamic conquest is to emphasize the political aspect of what's going on. Some people prefer to call them Arab conquests because they, it is debatable the extent to which the people who were participating in these conquests, or rather all of the people participating in these conquests, were motivated by religious conviction or indeed understood the very nature of the religious message that Muhammad and his successors were preaching and upholding. But what is clear is that the backbone of those conquering armies emanated from a particular geographic area, that is to say, the Arabian Peninsula, and were made up of members of particular kind of ethnic and cultural social groups, namely tribes who emanated from this region of the greater Middle East. By contrast, other people prefer to call these things the Islamic conquest, thereby emphasizing the religious or the ideological dimension. That is to say, these are armies who were motivated above all by a new novel religious message, one that valorized warfare in the name of God. These are semantic debates among academics that some people may kind of shrug their shoulders at. But in a way, it kind of touches on the two-faced nature of the military operations that lead to the creation of this Muslim empire. It is certainly an imperial political enterprise, but because it is also conquest in the name of God, in the interest of spreading the dominion of this new religion, there is an obvious religious element too. The more interesting question is whether the creation of an early Islamic empire, under the banner of these early believers, early Muslims, also entailed the creation of an Islamic society. And there, it is clear that it did not. It took a very, very long time for the actual population of this empire to become overwhelmingly Muslim. And indeed, in the period in which we can speak about a unitary Muslim empire, such as existed in the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, I think it is clear that the majority of the population was in fact non-Muslim. So, what does the religious significance of the empire mean when it is essentially a religion or an ideology of the elite, but most of the population was left to its own devices and its pre-Islamic traditions and religions? It's clearly something more complicated.
Case in point, people often get taught, or I often encounter people who have the idea that the Muslim advance out of Arabia was one of barbarism, forced conversion to Islam by the point of the sword. How true is that narrative? And if not, what's a more accurate reflection of these historical events?
Insofar as we have an archaeological picture of what takes place in the 7th and the 8th centuries, it is clear that although the conquering armies were spectacularly successful and won victory upon victory extremely rapidly, thereby creating this empire essentially out of nothing, these campaigns did not lead to widespread destruction. For instance, when people excavate late Roman or Sasanian cities in what became the heartland of the early Muslim Empire, there are not conspicuous destruction layers that date to the period of the conquests. It seems that often late ancient cities surrendered to the conquerors without a very significant fight, and that the conquerors maintained the institutions, the urban fabric, the social customs that had existed across these areas for a very, very long time before. So the picture of conquering armies sweeping out of the Arabian Peninsula, killing, plundering, forcibly converting the native population is just wrong. It's not to say these things were irenic. I'm not trying to downplay the violence of it, because obviously this was an extended, sustained military campaign that certainly did lead to the death of quite a lot of people on the battlefield. It entailed the toppling of the pre-Islamic Iranian Empire, the Sasanian Empire. It entailed the conquest of the choice provinces of the East Roman or Byzantine Empire. These were not, conquerors who marched in with, rose petals. That modern image, which is the opposite kind of what you're saying, is itself historically misleading and misinformed. But the early Muslim conquerors, although possessed of this new religious ideology, in many ways operated like a wide range of other pre-modern, pre-industrial empires. They were mainly interested in the extraction of resources from their conquered territories. They were relatively indifferent to imposing ideological religious conformity upon the mixed populations that they now governed. And in fact, there were strong incentives that drove people away from proselytizing the native population. In the very earliest generations of Muslims, there was a strong consensus in some quarters that Islam was not a religion that was to be preached to the masses, but rather this was a special religion for a special chosen people. In other words, Islam as being essentially a successor to Judaism, and the Arabs being the successors to the Jews as God's chosen people. And if you partake in that worldview, why would you want the riffraff to come in? And indeed, there's huge prejudice that many non-Arab converts to Islam experienced in that early period, precisely because it was Islam as a belief system, as an imperial identity, was something that was considered precious, that was not to be shared very, very widely. So for these and lots of other reasons, the rate of conversion was relatively slow. In terms of the Jewish, Christian, and Zoroastrian populations of the empires, those are the three major non-Muslim populations across the empire in the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. There was not a systematic or coherent system for governing them at the beginning, but over time it emerged and it crystallized. Scholars today refer to the dhimmi regime. Dhimmi is an Arabic word that refers to a protected person, i.e., a non-Muslim who is entitled to certain basic protections under the Islamic legal regime. And those people were essentially entitled to continue practicing their religions, to continue unmolested, unharmed, provided they paid tribute to the state. In later periods, this is a specific kind of religiously oriented tax known as the jizya. But provided they recognized the authority of the state, provided they paid tribute to its rulers, provided they did not rebel, they could sort of carry on. And so the story of religious change in the early period is one, to speak in very broad stroke, it's not one of speedy change, rather it's one of very, very slow and gradual change, significant but slow change.
How prevalent then were martyrs during the rise of Islam, and especially later in its history up through its golden age? Give us some examples of different martyrs and their situations.
In 2018, I wrote a book published by Princeton University Press called Christian Martyrs Under Islam, which was an attempt to tell the history of this neglected group of martyrs. And when I use the term martyr, I'm using the terminology of the historical sources that survive. These are mainly hagiographical accounts, that is to say, lives of saints, records of the deeds of individuals who, for one reason or another, ran afoul of the early Muslim authorities and were then executed. And they become martyrs not by dint of the execution, but rather by dint of the commemoration of the Christian communities who kept their memory, revered their relics, created pilgrimages around their tombs, that sort of thing. In a way, we're talking about two separate processes. There is the historical fact of an individual who is executed for one crime or another, and then there is a separate historical process that leads to that individual becoming a saint. So I want to be very clear about what I mean, especially when speaking about history and these people as historical actors. But the individuals who ended up becoming revered as martyrs in the early Islamic Empire were executed for usually one of two crimes. The most common was apostasy, that is to say, the crime of leaving Islam. From a relatively early date, Muslim jurists looked upon apostasy, the abandonment of Islam, as a capital offense. So most of these martyrs were individuals who had been born as Christians, converted to Islam under varied circumstances, and then returned to their original faith, refused to go back, and were therefore executed. An interesting subset of these apostate martyrs were individuals born into what appeared to be entirely Muslim families, who then converted to Christianity, again under various circumstances. The second major group were Christians who were executed for blasphemy, that is to say, the crime of disparaging the Prophet Muhammad in public. This is another, perhaps less widely attested crime, but a prominent one in the sources about these martyrs. So they're fascinating windows into this complex, fascinating period of religious change. There were not many of them. I mean, there's certainly enough to write a book about them, and there are enough of them to make one wonder how widespread any of these practices really were. But we're not talking about mass violence or persecution of Christians. We're talking about exceptional individuals who, for a variety of reasons, again, ran afoul of the Muslim authorities, did not avail themselves of the opportunity to repent. That is an important aspect of these stories, an important motif in the martyrdom literature, and also an important aspect of Islamic law in terms of how it treats people accused of apostasy and blasphemy. They were required to be given the opportunity to repent. And only at the end of this process were these individuals then executed by the Umayyad or the Abbasid authorities. So in a way, they are representative of the society in the sense that they are a reflection of wider trends, religious trends, a late antique, predominantly Christian society that is slowly becoming predominantly Muslim. But in the very fact that they swim against the current, so to speak, in the very fact that they refuse to repent of their offenses, they are not the rule, but rather exceptions to the rule.
Similarly, how likely was it that a Muslim would convert from Islam to Judaism or Christianity? And would this count as apostasy, I assume, or would they just be under the secondary dhimmi system?
Well, as I mentioned, apostasy from a very early date was considered a capital offense. I think that although the vast majority of conversions in this period were in the direction of Islam, there seemed to have been some number of people who, as I put it in an article I wrote, swam against the current, who went from Islam to Christianity. That form of religious change is better attested than, say, conversions from Islam to Judaism or conversions from Islam to Zoroastrianism or indeed any other non-Muslim religion. There is surely evidence for these things happening, but it is far less rich than what we find in the case of Christians. So whether one was born a Christian, converted to Islam, and then went back to Christianity, or one was born a Muslim and then converted to Christianity, one was considered an apostate, in Arabic, a murtad, someone who reneged on his original faith. And so, yes, the same punishments were imposed upon these people if they refused to go back. I don't think that this was ever a mass phenomenon. I mean, precisely because there was such a kind of a theoretically powerful and inflexible regime that surrounded conversion. That is to say, you could become a Muslim, but you couldn't go back. I think that there were strong disincentives. So most people, once they became Muslims, never looked back. But again, the lives of the martyrs indicate that there is some subterranean culture in the early Islamic period, and indeed in many periods of Middle Eastern history for a long time after, of people who, for whatever reason, did leave Islam and managed to live out their lives as Christians or presumably adherents of any number of other religions. And this is driven by a number of things. I mean, religiously mixed families are a very, very important setting in which these more eccentric or less widely attested forms of conversion are attested. Again, the early Muslim empire was overwhelmingly made up of Christians, especially when we're talking about places like Egypt, Palestine, Syria, parts of Iraq, the Caucasus. So this was essentially a late antique Christian society with a Muslim governing minority. And when one sees it in that light, it's not purely a story of, say, the church in the shadow of the mosque, to invoke the title of a famous book by Sidney Griffith, kind of the dean of Arab Christian studies, especially in the English-speaking world, a professor at the Catholic University of America. Rather, I think there's a compelling case to be made that the important dynamic in the early Islamic period was not the church in the shadow of the mosque, but in some ways the mosque in the shadow of the church. And when you think about the demographic imbalance, the fact that the early Muslims were very much in the process of defining their theological system, refining what it meant to be a Muslim, considering that many conversions to Islam were driven by contingency, we're talking about large group conversions, that kind of thing. It is possible, indeed easy to imagine, that there were larger numbers of people who may have been born Muslims and then chosen something else than the historical sources otherwise let us see.
We're going to backtrack just a moment. Do you have a favorite Christian martyr under Islam within the book that you wrote?
I think my favorite one comes from Damascus. I like him because we share Damascus in common. I spent a lot of time in Damascus before the civil war in Syria. I learned my Arabic in Damascus for the first time. And this is a saint who comes from 8th century Damascus. His name was Elias. Elias, according to his biography, which was written in Greek, was a young boy who found himself working in the household of a wealthy Muslim in Damascus. And at this point, Damascus had ceased to be the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate. It was now a provincial capital under the new Caliphate, the Caliphate of the Abbasids, who were based in Iraq, but still a very important city. And according to the story, one night he was serving at the party of this wealthy Muslim family for whom he worked. And it says that the guests, the Muslim guests, taunted him and asked him why he was not a Christian. And he refused to kind of cave to their taunts. And he said, "I'm a Christian, leave me alone." And in the course of the night, as the wine flows, if you read the story, this young man went onto the dance floor and began to kind of socialize, fraternize with the guests. And one of the guests reportedly removed his belt. The belt was a special article of clothing that non-Muslims were required to wear under the emerging dhimmi regime, the legal regime that governed relations between Muslims and non-Muslims. And there were rules that dictated that Muslims would dress in a certain way and their non-Muslim subjects would dress in another way. So one of these distinguishing articles of clothing was called the zunar in Arabic. So if you believe the story, they whip off his zunar without his realizing it. He has a great time. And then the following morning, he's getting up to go to church. And one of the Muslim partygoers says, "Where are you going?" He says, "I'm going to pray. It's Sunday morning." And the guy says, "Did I not see you convert to Islam last night?" i.e. referring to the dramatic removal of the zunar on the dance floor. Anyway, the rest of the story goes as you can imagine. He claims that he never converted. The people who witnessed this event happen claim that he did convert. So he is suddenly an unwitting convert and an equally unwitting apostate. And what I love about the story is that it touches on the the fine line between fact and fiction when you study the cases of these people. We're dependent on sources that are highly literary, highly often fictionalized, and figuring out who Elias was as a real historical actor versus the Elias of memory and of the hagiography is very hard. But I think it also speaks to the complicated dynamics that surround conversion in this period, and that conversion could very often be represented not through a sincere, well-informed profession of a new faith, but rather was often demonstrated through the adoption of outward markers of belonging in one community or another. And in this case, it appears that he doesn't seem to have assented to converting, much less apostatizing. But the bigger theme here is that it was very hard to differentiate a Muslim from a Christian in certain social settings. They spoke common languages, they lived in the same neighborhoods, often they belonged to the same families. And in such a situation, it could be difficult indeed for a person to basically establish his religious identity very clearly. So that's my favorite martyr that I wrote about in that book. And I think the story is a fun one and makes one think very hard.
You've also written a little bit about Zoroastrianism. How influential was Zoroastrianism on Islam? How much theology was exchanged, or is this conception overblown? I specifically ask this because there's a line in Britannica saying that Zoroastrianism likely influenced other major Western religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So, how impactful was Zoroastrianism on not only Islam, but do you think on Judaism and Christianity's rise?
Well, for those of your listeners who may not have heard of Zoroastrianism, maybe a word on what we're talking about. Zoroastrianism is an ancient Iranian belief system that, in short, was the religion of the pre-Islamic kings of Iran. So when we talk about the established state religion of the Sasanian Empire before the Muslims conquer Iraq, Iran, Central Asia, we're talking about Zoroastrianism. Now, your Britannica definition of Zoroastrianism might have also mentioned that it is not a monotheistic religion. Rather, it is typically classified as a dualistic religion. That is to say, it does not believe in a single cosmic principle of the kind that, say, Jews, Christians, and Muslims do, monotheists, but rather it believes that the universe is kind of governed by a tug of war between two cosmic principles, one all powerful and all good. And this is the God known as Ahura Mazda, Ohar Mazd, depending on what you're reading. And his antagonist, his cosmic antagonist, is a Satan-like figure named Ahriman. So for this reason, Zoroastrians are commonly classified not as monotheists, not as pagans, but rather as something in between, as dualists. And they remained a very significant portion of the population of the greater Iranian world for a long time after the initial Muslim conquest of that region, much in the way that Christians and Jews remained a major part of the population. In other parts of the early Muslim empire, Zoroastrians did not disappear overnight. As for the Zoroastrian influence on other religions, I mean, the classic example is that sometimes it's speculated that the figure of Satan found in the Hebrew Bible as well as the New Testament, that figure, that concept is heavily indebted to Zoroastrianism, and that there are strong relations between that character and the figure of Ahriman, such as I described it just a minute ago. Now, when it comes to Islam specifically, something that I would zero in on is, again, this idea of what it means to be a monotheist and what it means to be a dualist. In the early Islamic period, in say the 2 or 3 centuries after the life of the Prophet Muhammad, once the conquests have settled down and you get big cosmopolitan empires, especially in places like Baghdad, the early Muslims found themselves constantly debating with members of other religions, and often their sparring partners were extremely sophisticated philosophers and theologians. Who would spar with the Muslims on very basic and important aspects of theology and doctrine, because they did not share a common scriptural grammar, in the sense that Zoroastrians had a scripture, the Muslims had the scripture of the Quran. This was different from the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, all this. They often had to make recourse to philosophical arguments grounded in reason. And lots of those arguments hinged on whether it is theologically, philosophically defensible to believe in one God, or whether it is better to believe in two principles of the kind that Zoroastrians did. And ultimately, these are sort of Book of Job style arguments about the problem of evil. Is it possible to believe in a God who is, on the one hand, all good, but permits the existence of evil in the world? This either tells us that God is actually not all good, or it tells us that God is all good, but is actually not all powerful. So that's an old philosophical dilemma. And the Zoroastrian answer was that it can be resolved satisfactorily only if you posit the existence of two cosmic beings, one all good, one all evil. And so it was this critique of monotheism that was brought by Zoroastrians and other dualistic Iranian religions in the early Islamic period that in some ways forced early Muslim theologians, systematic theologians, to start developing basic defenses of monotheism that have in turn become stock features of Islamic belief until the present. We might not see the original context in which these doctrines, the defense of monotheism, the unicity of God, the oneness of God, we may not necessarily see the original context in which they were developed, but those are still core tenets of Islam today, and they originate in this context of debate and sparring, often with dualistic religions such as Zoroastrianism.
We will pause for a sponsor break from Handy Mike and Genesis Contracting. Handy Mike and Genesis are a locally owned and family operated handyman and contractor company serving the greater Charlottesville area since 2016. They are a Class A licensed, bonded, and insured contractor with over 60 years of knowledge. Their teams of skilled, reliable, and trustworthy technicians have been handpicked in order to provide our customers with outstanding service across a broad range of tradesman skills. Handy Mike can do all of your home maintenance repairs and small projects, from changing a light bulb to deck repairs to electrical and plumbing fixtures, and so much more. Genesis Contracting can handle larger jobs, including bathroom and kitchen renovations, remodels, and additions. If you're looking for a team to help make your dreams a reality and bring your concept to creation, call them today for a free estimate. 434-422-6000. You can also find more of their information in the show notes. Now, back to the show.
Were Zoroastrians treated better or worse than Jews and Christians under the dhimmi system, or were they even allowed to be in the dhimmi system?
So as I mentioned a minute ago, the dhimmi system is an extremely important aspect of early Islamic history, and lots of people spend time studying the evolution of the system. So before I answer your question, I just want to say up front that the dhimmi system did not exist in an elaborated or crystallized form at the very beginning. For instance, on the subject of Zoroastrians, the Quran mentions Zoroastrians in passing only once. So it took a long time for Muslim jurists to kind of figure out what the general stance was on these people. And so by the time of the 9th century, for instance, when we can really speak about an elaborated legal system for governing the non-Muslims in all their varied forms, there's a big distinction that emerges. Muslim theologians and jurists speak about a category called the Ahl Kitab, which essentially means the people who possess a legitimate divine revelation. And the Kitab, the revelation in question, is either the Torah or the Gospels. So those are Jews and Christians. And then they speak about a wider category of non-Muslims called the Ahl al-Dhimma, the people who were entitled to non-Muslims entitled to the protections of the state. That included Jews and Christians, but it was a wider category that also included Zoroastrians. Zoroastrians, in the eyes of the early Muslims, did not possess an authentic divine revelation before the advent of Islam. And this was partly because, as a matter of fact, they have separate origins in the religious history of the Near East. They were, for the reasons we've been chatting about already, dualists with strong polytheistic elements. So they could not be considered Ahl Kitab, but they were considered protected peoples. So for all intents and purposes, they were treated not so differently. But because they were not part of this monotheistic club that included the Muslims, the Jews, and the Christians, there were certain issues or areas on which Zoroastrians were treated slightly differently. So for instance, a Muslim man was entitled to marry up to 4 women. Those women could be Jews, those women could be Christians. And those women would not necessarily have to convert in order to marry a Muslim man. By contrast, a Muslim man was not supposed to marry a Zoroastrian woman. Now, this surely happened as a matter of historical fact, but under the legal and theological regime of the earliest Muslims, say in the Abbasid period, it was not supposed to happen. There are other things involving the sharing of food, dietary laws, that kind of thing. But for all intents and purposes, I think that these groups were probably treated largely the same. And for the average Muslim who was not a jurist, who was not a theologian, someone who thought in these systematic intellectual categories, I think that the main concern was, did these people submit to the authority of the state? Did they pay tribute? And the rest was basically left to others. So that's the way that I think about it.
I got 2 more questions, a little bit more personal, but you expressed right before we started recording, you're a Catholic and you're a believer. How does the study of Islam impact your faith?
Well, I've always enjoyed the time I spend in the Middle East. The Middle East is a region where religion still matters. Religious identity is not just a figment of history, an artifact of history, but it's still a way in which societies are organized today, for better or worse, as everyone knows from the news. I'm thinking here of what's happened in Syria recently. But that always fascinated me. And I think that as someone who was interested in religion as an intellectual matter, but also as a personal matter, I felt like there were aspects of Middle Eastern societies, Arab societies, that I could connect with, both intellectually and personally. I guess as a result of my own religious background, I'm generally interested in religion. I'd like to think that I'm a responsible historian, whatever other hats I wear, that I'm an objective and rigorous historian. But I suppose as a result of my own personal background, my family background, I think religion is an interesting subject. I also think it's an important subject. I mean, it wasn't all that long ago that magazines like The Economist said that religion wouldn't matter. Statements like that just don't, never made any sense to me. And I think studying Muslim societies, both in the past and the present, also disprove that theory. So I'm willing to believe that religion is a force that shapes human societies, often for the better, in my view. And perhaps that's as a result of my own personal experience, whereas maybe someone who does not have a religious background, a religious upbringing, or can, may have a harder time seeing that, or might look to other factors that shape human societies of more of a materialist nature. Those are important too. I just think that they have to be understood in a wider context that can include personal beliefs, the way in which religion can motivate people to act in ways both good and bad. So I suppose that's one way to answer your question.
We are recording on the 19th of December, so when this goes out early in the new year, this question might not even matter. But how do you feel about the situation in Syria? You said you learned your Arabic in Damascus. How do you think the Christian population is going to do? How do you think? Do you have any sense of what's on the ground looking like right now?
I have a mixture of feelings about what's happening in Syria right now. Perhaps it's naive, but my basic feeling is one of optimism. I'm optimistic because the Assad regime was absolutely ferocious. It barbarized the Syrian people for more than 50 years. And I have always thought that a precondition for Syria getting better was always the departure of Assad. Again, Syrians and plenty of people outside might feel that that's naive. There are plenty of people who, for good reasons, think that that society is very difficult to govern, maybe impossible to govern, and only a regime as strong-willed, iron-fisted as the Assad regime could manage it. But I think that's a false argument. So I think it was clearly a false stability that Assad and his family brought to Syria. And so if Syria was ever going to improve, especially from the nadir of recent years when the country was absolutely devastated by this terrible civil war, that was only ever going to happen with the departure of Assad. He was never going to be part of the solution. It was only in his absence that Syria would change. So that's what I feel optimistic about. The pessimistic side of the ledger, I have great concerns about what will happen to the minorities in Syria. The minorities who, for better or worse, have been perceived as complicit in the rule of the Assad regime for many decades now. There has been a sectarian logic that has governed Syria for a very long time that has welded certain groups, especially minorities, to the regime, and in the process alienated them from other elements in Syrian society, especially Sunnis, who are a demographic majority. So I think that there might be rough times ahead for Christians, certainly for the Alawites, the members of the same sect as the Assad family, who were its chief supporters over these many years. Big picture, I would like to imagine that Syria in the long run will hopefully be a more stable and peaceful and just place, but I think it will be a very bumpy road getting there. And in some ways, I think what we're headed for resembles previous periods in Syrian history. I've been thinking lots about cycles of Syrian history and how the long durée of Syrian history can help us imagine what may be coming there. And there are periods of basically stability in Syria, frankly, a stability that is often brought by domination by outside powers. But there are other moments in Syrian history, and here I'm thinking of the central late Middle Ages when we have the Crusaders and Saladin and lots of other groups of fragmentation and chaos. And so I think that's probably what we're headed for in the near term, but in the long term, I hope for stability.
Well, Dr. Sahner, thank you so much for coming on Church Coffee. We'll see everyone next week, and our prayers are with the people of Syria.
Thank you.
Our album art was done by my wife, and our theme music was composed by TJ Stokes.